Speaking of which, you have to tell the epic origin story of how you got the job at Blizzard. As we said, you were this legendary gamer and now legendary troll on EverQuest, username to go. You gave a lot of edgy feedback to the devs, telling them in now famous, there's several rants. There's a famous one where you tell many of them to do a bunch of things, including to pull their heads out of their asses. You were loved and respected because you gave a lot of specific ways that the game could be improved. And that's an important thing to say. You weren't just talking shit. You actually really loved and cared for the game, and you gave them, in the language of the time, advice on how to improve their game. And it's funny because, like, you look back to those messages, it's inspiring to me. It should be informative and inspiring to a lot of people because you're really legit full-time talking shit. And now, and always have been, like one of the kindest, most loved human beings in the entire gaming industry. Anyway, how did that lead to you getting a job at Blizzard?
So when the first guild leader left Legacy of Steel, the founder, he was a guy named, his online name was Dread. That was his name. He left. And our guild was kind of in this listless spin for a while. And eventually somebody stepped up and took his position as guild leader. And that person's name was Ariel, who was this blonde wood elf warrior female who always refused to wear a helmet because thought their character was so pretty, wanted to show their face all the time. So Ariel was a great guild leader for us and made me like a assistant guild leader, raid leader, officer type in the guild. And over time, Ariel got busier and busier and would send me messages like, hey, I'm not going to be online, tomorrow, or I'm not going to be online tonight. Can you run the raid? Can you run the raid? And running the raids was very natural for me. And it was my first experience with leadership in my life of like, how do you motivate people? Like, what does motivation look like? What does discipline look like? How do you inspire people? When do you force people versus encourage them? So it was a learning experience for me on the fly. And I had the safety net of the real guild leader would log in eventually.
I should mention, I'm just now reading about, doing a bunch of research on Justinian of the Roman Empire, and he rose from being a peasant to being emperor. So I see a lot of parallels in your life journey from peasant to emperor. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
At least EverQuest guild leader. That's as much as I can say.
Uber
Uber guild leader, best guild on the nameless server. So as time went on, Ariel became busier and busier. And then one day they contacted me and we were having this like whisper back and forth. And they said, you're going to have to take over the guild. I'm just too busy. And then it came out later. Well, let me back up a second. I started fooling around, like around this time, Half-Life 1 had come out. And with both Duke Nukem and Half-Life 1, one of the incredible things that those companies did back in the day was when they shipped the game, they shipped the editor on the CD. And if you were curious enough, you could like fire up that editor and fool around with it. So I made a Duke Nukem level, and you'd send it off to like those UK programming magazines, and you get excited because your level was in some random magazine. And then I started making like Half-Life levels, and Ariel had stepped down as guild leader. I had become guild leader, and then at one point, Ariel contacts me and says, hey, you were talking about those Half-Life levels you made. I want to see those. I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like, I didn't know you played Half-Life. Like, yeah, maybe we can get a server up and I can play them. And Ariel tells me, no, mail them to this address in Irvine. And because, again, to rewind in the time machine for a second, to send something like a Half-Life level over the internet would have taken like 12 hours. So you actually like burned it onto a CD and stuck it in the mail. So I put my Half-Life levels, I send them to Ariel, and he says, my name's Rob. I'm a designer at Blizzard Entertainment. I hear you're in Pasadena because you mention it. I would write about, the Rose Parade and all these things on our website. It was blogging before blogging existed. So he knew I lived in Pasadena. He's like, Irvine's only an hour away. Why don't you come down, see Blizzard, and you can also meet, and he names like 4 people in the guild. And I'm like, they all work at Blizzard too? He's like, yeah, we're all Blizzard. And it was so weird because during that era, I didn't have a lot of money. It was not like kind of nowadays, it feels like everybody plays every game, but you had to be selective. So like I never bought StarCraft or Diablo or Warcraft. I was much more of the Half-Life, Quake 3 guy around that time. And I never played a Blizzard game, and I just got invited to like go to Blizzard Entertainment.
Was Blizzard already legendary? With the Warcraft and StarCraft, was it building this like great legend of this game company that seemingly doesn't miss?
It was very much on its way to enshrining itself as being one of the legendary game. Like it was beloved by gamers, but there were still ignorant people like me who hadn't played, War II or Diablo 2 or StarCraft, which was shocking to people.
So you weren't like freaking out.
No, I was freaking out in a different sense. I'm like, am I going to get mugged when
Right.
is this a scam? Because you didn't meet people off the internet.
Yeah.
So I drove down there. I ended up, there was Rob Pardo, who at that time was the lead designer on Warcraft 3. And he was Ariel, so, okay, it wasn't a woman after all. It wasn't this blonde wood elf. I don't know what you expect at that point. It was Rob Pardo. To this day, a great friend of mine named Scott Mercer was the enchanter in our EverQuest guild, a guy named Dale O'Min. There was a guy named Roman Kenny who was like this totally psychotic wizard who played in our guild. And I had lunch with these guys. We just went out to Irvine to like a restaurant. And, forgive me for the misuse of the phrase, but it was like my coming out moment. And we talked about games having that stigma and being embarrassed about who you are and what you like. Like up until that point, I would never tell friends, family, like, I love games. I'm playing this game, EverQuest. It's so cool. We just killed a dragon. And so you were hiding this part of your identity. And I'm out to lunch with these guys in Irvine, and we're talking about dragons and swords and, raid tactics and talking shit on all the people in the guild. And I literally had this moment where I felt like myself for the first time. I just felt like so comfortable. And that was an eye-opening moment. And after that lunch happened, he invited me for a couple more lunches down, I just thought as like, oh, now I made friends with these people online. Now we know each other in real life, and they happen to work for this game company. And another one of the lunches, they invite this troll warrior to have lunch with us, whose name in the game was Barfa, the troll warrior. And Barfa wasn't somebody who played with us all the time, but kind of like Ariel got into the guild kind of on the side. It was one of those like inside invites of like, who's Barfa? I don't know, but Barfa's in the guild now. And there was, at the time, it was a new dungeon called The Hole, and we had never done it before. And we jumped down in this hole, and we're doing this whole dungeon, and everything goes wrong, as it's prone to do in EverQuest. And the whole guild escapes, except for Barfa, whose troll character is so big he can't jump out of the exit. And I had this potion that was like a really expensive potion that was a teleport potion that, no one but someone in the Uber guild could afford at the time. And I hand the potion to Barfa and I said, "Here, use this. It'll teleport you out." And I'm a rogue. I can just stealth and get out of the dungeon on my own. So I saved Barfa, not really knowing who Barfa was, and I did it with a very expensive potion. Having lunch, Rob introduced me. This is Alan Adham. He plays Barfa. I'm like, "Oh, Barfa." And he has, "You saved me in the hole that time." Well, it turns out Alan was the founder of Blizzard, and he was sort of the head of everything at that time. It was Alan, Mike Morheim, and Frank Pierce. And what I didn't realize with these lunches were like, I just loved them because I felt like I was myself. I felt true happiness being surrounded by these, people who were talking about video games and I felt comfortable around. And one day, Rob logs into EverQuest. He wasn't playing much at the time. He said, "I want you tomorrow to check the Blizzard job site."
Mhm.
I'm like, "Okay, like I'll check the Blizzard job site." And they had announced World of Warcraft and posted on the job site
Mhm.
was the job for an associate quest designer. And the funniest part of it was, I forget if it was a requirement or a plus in the job description, but they're like, "We really want somebody with a creative writing degree." And I'm like, "You guys set this up for me." Like they were just looking, and it was that hindsight moment of like, actually these guys were just interviewing me for
Yeah.
6 months. They were actually friends and they were really cool about it too. And I just had the fuck it moment, like that job opened up. I applied with all my heart, they had a bunch of quest writing on it. Um, and then I went through like a pretty hardcore 6-month recruiting process because they never hired designers from out of the company. Traditionally, designers were promoted from within Blizzard. Either they would like transfer out of other disciplines or they would come from quality assurance, tech support. So hiring somebody off the street was kind of a big deal for them. And they really put me through a grilling. It was the first time I met Chris Metzen,
Mhm.
who is maybe the most inspirational, creative person on the planet. And they paired me, they did this interview pairing. There were these two guys. It was Kevin Jordan, who
Mhm.
is one of the original designers on WoW. Really, he doesn't get enough credit for his contributions. He was one of the earliest class designers, PvP designers, but he's a really quiet guy.
Mhm.
And they paired him with Chris, and Chris just owns the room.
Mhm.
Chris, you could just sit and listen to him. He's so creative. He's so passionate. And the way he articulates things, like you just instantly become a fan of Chris when you're around Chris. And Chris, Kevin, and I go to lunch at this Italian place that was across the street from Blizzard. And I remember Chris made a stop to buy cigarettes, on the way to the interview.
Mhm.
And then every other word out of Chris's mouth was like, fuck and shit.
Mhm.
And I had come from this whole like corporate culture from my dad's recruiting business where I'd never imagined somebody would curse in an interview or stop to buy smokes. And again, it was like I'm around my people. Like I never
Mhm.
smoked, but just, being around people who didn't care about
Mhm.
what the corporate norms were was so inspiring. And then my last interview was with Alan and Rob and a great programmer named Bob Fitch. Like, I think he's one of the first 5 developers at Blizzard. Uh, and they took me to an Arco station that had a Jack in the Box. You know how like
Mhm.
sometimes they'll combo.
Mhm.
It was like Arco Jack in the Box. And that was my final interview at Blizzard, was at the Arco Jack in the Box. And I remember thinking to myself, these guys just brought me to a Jack in the Box that's in an Arco station. I need to work here. Like, these are my people. This is where I
Yeah.
belong. Like, it was the greatest thing ever. And so, yeah, that's my crazy journey to Blizzard.
Start at the bottom and end up at the top in the Jack in the Box.